What we're doing today is we're holding an annual event called the Day in the Trenches. Today we're hoping that the visitors who come here get an experience of how the soldiers lived while training, what was it like behind the lines in the headquarters. They'll get some demonstrations on bayonet training, how to defend themselves. There'll be the trench routine in how the soldiers conducted themselves in the training, in the trenches or during the actual fighting. There are some temporary exhibits. Today we have a private collector who wants to remain anonymous, has a beautiful collection of World War I German firearms. And it's a welcome addition to what's on this side. You know, we have a nice collection of Canadian military, but it's nice to see what the enemy used, and he brought it out today. And there's also a special exhibit on the paper war. We call it papers, documents, posters of Canada in the First World War. So there's sheet music, there's letters, there's diaries on exhibit today. Plus, there's also the museum in the basement, where we have a gentleman who came all the way from Saskatchewan, from Regina Military Museum, to manage the museum in the basement.
Welcome to Suicide Corner. Watch out for the snipers. This is going to give you a representation of what the frontline trenches would have looked like during the First World War. Coming down the middle here, we have a communications trench. What would have been different back in the First War? Of course, it wouldn't have been quite so straight. They were dug zigzagging back and forth. Anybody think of why?
So you can't shoot down the trench.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. If it was straight, they could set up a machine gun and interdict any troops, any food, any supplies that would be coming forward from rear areas. So they had the trenches zigzag back and forth. They would have been also deeper by about at least another 2 feet, maybe even 3, so that I would be below the surface or layer level of the parapet. In order to shoot over the parapet, I would have a fire step, a raised platform, which I would stand on to shoot if an attack was happening on our trenches. And the standard routine for troops in the front line was that a half hour before first light, till a half hour after, you would do a drill called stand to, because that was the time that the enemy was most likely to attack, as your eyes are adjusting from darkness to light to do a surprise attack on your position. So you would stand to, and then of course, if nothing happened, you would get the command stand down. And that's because you would literally stand down from the fire step back into the bottom of the trenches, and in order of priority, clean your rifle, clean yourself, grab a bite to eat. After that, you might be tasked with refilling sandbags to replace damaged ones in case there was shelling overnight by trench mortars or artillery. You might be on sentry. During nighttime, 1 in 5 stood on sentry. In daytime, 1 in 10. The way you would observe no man's land during the daytime would be with a periscope. I forgot to pack mine, so you just have to imagine a box, a mirror at the bottom, a mirror at the top at 45-degree angles. Put the periscope over the parapet, keep your head below, and look through the mirror to observe the enemy. If you weren't tasked to do anything, soldiers' priorities were get some sleep, you know, especially if you were on sentry in the middle of the night. If you weren't sleepy, you might want to write a letter home or a postcard. 12 million pieces of mail came and went on the Western Front on a daily basis. Well, think of how many million soldiers there were on both sides. You know, there was all the Germans. On our side, you would have had Belgians, French, Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, Portuguese, right? All of those countries sent contingents to the Western Front. If every man sent one piece of mail and receive one piece of mail, very quickly you're up to 12 million. And for the soldiers who were part of the British Empire, they actually had a special postcard which you're allowed to do one thing, or two things really. One, you were allowed to write the address on, and then on the flip side were pre-printed lines. And you ticked off the appropriate box.
I'm alive.
I am well. I received your postcard, letter, package. I'm in hospital but recovering. You know, and it was just to make sure that your parents, wife, children knew that you were alive and well. And it didn't cost you anything. If you wanted to write a longer letter, of course it would go to a censor. And if anything was considered to be of sensitive military information, they would excise it. In other words, basically take a razor and cut it out of your letter, which means sometimes you would lose the stuff on the back as well. So you have to be very careful. So a lot of soldiers, because it was free, would send these prepackaged postcards. Now, in the front line, what I'm standing on is called a traverse. And then that area up there and around the corner over there is something called a fire bay. That's where the shooting would come from. Right? And you'll notice it's all right angle turns. And the reason for that, if a shell from a trench mortar or artillery piece landed in your trenches, since the force of the blast is going to follow the lines of least resistance, most of the blast is going to go up. If it landed in that fire bay, it might kill or wound the men there, but the men in adjacent fire bays would be fine. So you're designing this to minimize casualties. Also, if the enemy attacked your trench and got in, what would they control? They would control only as far as the corners. And you could bring up reinforcements to counterattack very closely without being observed or for them to be able to shoot at you. Now, think of this pattern for the front line stretching from the Swiss border to the English Channel on our side and on the German side. 100 to 150 meters behind that would be the support line, which would have very similar construction. Another 150 to 200 or so meters behind that would be the reserve line. With, again, not quite as extensive because it was less likely to get attacked, but you had those three lines on our side, the same three lines on the German side, until the Germans constructed the Hindenburg line, in which they had concrete pillboxes with interlocking lines of fire. Because they were running out of men, they couldn't man a continuous line, so they had these strong points in the pillboxes. Now, a Canadian infantry brigade, of which there were 3 in each of the 4 Canadian divisions, consisted of 4 battalions. So, 1 battalion would spend a week in the front lines. Then a week later would rotate to the support, a week later to the reserve, and then would be out of the line, and there would be this continuous rotation, and that was in a static area where you weren't attacking or being attacked. Right? You were just holding the line while attacks were going on elsewhere. Right? So it worked out. You spent 3 weeks in the trenches, getting further and further from the front, and then you spent a week out of the line where you had a chance to have a bath, get your uniform deloused, go to a YMCA hut for a sandwich and a cup of coffee, maybe pick up some stationery there to write a more extensive letter to go home. You might go to something called an estaminet, which was a sidewalk cafe, and get some fresh eggs fried up with some bacon, and maybe a little plonk on the side. Everybody understand plonk? Who doesn't understand plonk? Is that yes you do or no you don't?
No, I don't.
Okay, for those who do, what is plonk?
Wine.
Yes. What type of wine?
Not very good wine.
Not very good wine. You know what it comes from? Anybody speak French here? A little bit. Un peu.
Un peu.
White wine in French is?
Le vin blanc.
right, and Vin Blanc to the British and Canadians became Plonk.
I never put that together.
We were brutal to the French language, if you were not a native French speaker. Another common phrase was napu. So if you lost something, or it was broken, or it ran out, British soldiers and Canadian soldiers would say, it's napu, which is from the French, il n'y a plus, it is no more. And how many have heard of Toodaloo?
Yep.
And you know where that comes from? The French phrase, à tout à l'heure. À tout à l'heure.
Which means what?
It's kind of a goodbye until later, right? Until later. Ta-ta for now, sort of thing, right? The city of Ypres in Flanders was better known to British and Canadians as Wipers, because that's what it was, Y-P-E-R-S. How do you pronounce that? Well, that's Wipers, of course. In fact, there was a newspaper called the Wipers Times, which was kind of a comic edition to keep up morale in the trenches. In addition to the mail that came and went. Of course, if you were having a bath, you might also get your uniform deloused. Lice crawling up and down the seams of your shirt and tunic were chronic. Soldiers would have something they called chats. And chatting in the trenches, where you got together with some of your friends, you stripped to the waist, and you ran your fingernails along the seams of your shirt to pop all the lice that were crawling up and down inside your shirt seams. Now, we kind of look at that and are grossed out, but you know, our grandfathers and great-grandfathers lived with that. That was their daily existence, including, you know, bodies hanging on the wire, right? Rats the size of cats running around, well fed because they were nibbling on the bodies hanging on the wire. Anybody have any questions?
How many people, you said they moved to the first to the...
Yeah, a battalion full strength was about 800 men.
800?
Which you wouldn't have everybody in the front lines, because you would have transport drivers, you would have cooks, you would have clerks, you would have a cobbler to repair the boots, you would have some tailors to repair uniforms. So not everybody was a frontline soldier. So you would have had maybe what they called a trench strength of 650 to 750, depending on casualties. So if you'd been in an attack or been attacked, you might have had, you know, a fair number of wounded or killed. Even if it wasn't a major attack going on. You know, there was constant shelling even in quiet sectors, just so nobody would get too complacent, right? And if you were planning an attack, you would want to find out as much as you could about the Germans. So often they sent over platoon to company size trench raids to try and grab prisoners or maps or something that would give them an idea of what troops are over there. You know, are they the more laissez-faire Bavarians and Saxons, or are they the more aggressive Prussians? You know, if you're planning an attack, you don't want to go into it blind. So you try to get as much information, try to find out as much as you could about the layout of the German defensive positions before you put an attack in. So trench raids, you know, Canadians were very aggressive, as were the Australians, and by the end of the war we were referred to as the shock troops of empire. To the point where, if the Canadians were going to be in an attack, the British High Command wanted to keep them out of the front line as long as possible, till the very last minute, so the Germans wouldn't catch wind that the Canadian Corps was opposite them, because that's generally going to be the place where the next offensive was going to start.
Would they do the opposite sometimes?
I'm sorry?
Would they do the opposite sometimes, sort of expose Canadians at some place to make the Germans think that something is going to happen?
You don't want to tire the troops out.
No, but just a few.
I haven't come across any incidents of that happening, but certainly in the last 100 days, which was the pursuit to Mons. Like the Germans in the spring of 1918 had what they called the Kaiserschlacht, the last major German offensive in the West. And then it petered out. They were running out of manpower. They fell back to the Hindenburg Line. So for the Canadians to crack the Hindenburg Line and the pursuit to Mons, that was back to open warfare again. They sort of broke out of the trenches and got beyond the trench lines, and then it was, that's when the cavalry could do the stuff it was being paid for. Where you had all kinds of cavalry charges happening, which for years were impossible.
So before that breakthrough, it was basically a stalemate for 3-4 years?
There was ground lost and gained. Like when the Canadians captured Vimy Ridge, the French had tried since like 1914 to recapture it, and it wasn't until April of 1917 that the Canadians did it as part of the larger Battle of Arras that was going on at the same time. So from the overall plan, it was big for us, not quite so big, in the grand scheme of things. But we captured ground that the French had tried for several years, and because of the height of the ridge, the Germans had to fall back about 20 kilometers because any closer and we could observe every movement that they were doing. So from the height of the ridge, I've been there, and you can see a huge distance. So the Germans had to basically fall back out of range of observation.
So did they ever lose Vimy Ridge again?
Once it was captured, it was held till the end of the war, which is why it's now Canadian soil.
My grandfather was there.
Yeah. The next big offensive was Hill 70, which was close to the city of Lens. And Arthur Currie at this time was now in command of the Canadian Corps. Vimy was still under the command of Sir Julian Byng, who was a Brit, with Currie as his deputy and protege. So after Vimy, Byng moved on to higher command. Currie took over the Canadian Corps, and the next big offensive was Hill 70, where he was told to capture the city of Lens, and he said, well, this is dominated by this high feature Hill 70. They'll be able to shell us because they can observe every movement we make. Why don't we capture Hill 70 instead? Because the German tactical doctrine was immediate counterattack. And they said, what we'll do is we'll capture Hill 70 and we'll wait for the Germans to come at us, and we'll blow them to bits with artillery. So that was essentially what the Canadians did. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago that they actually put up a monument commemorating the Canadian victory at Hill 70. It was like, for years, Canada's forgotten victory.
Right.
there.